we definitely wanted to have this person back on the show. One of my favorite guests that we have had on, and there's so much to discuss, not just with WWE returning to Saudi Arabia this coming Saturday with Crown Jewel, but also coming off what was, all I can tell you, is a spectacle from this past weekend in Saudi Arabia for the fight between Tyson Fury and Francis Ngannou. We're talking about the man behind Sports Politica. You've read his work in the New York Times, The Guardian, Bloody Elbow. Karim Zidan returning to the show. Hello, Karim.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back, guys. How are you?
We're doing pretty well. None of us flew over to Saudi Arabia this past weekend. The three of us might be the only people in combat sports who did not receive invitations from the kingdom. But I can't say, Karim, I had all that much interest in this fight. But come Saturday, just tuning into it, I just felt as a experiment and watching what this was. To me, at the end of it, it was like the fight was almost secondary to everything that you saw. Like, this was just opulence times 10, where the world of Eminem and Vince McMahon and Kanye West intersected with a boxing fight, an arena that was erected solely for the purpose of this fight. And I came away with it, Karim, like, this may not even be the future of combat sports. It might be the now of combat sports. Like, that was my conclusion at the end of Saturday.
Well, honestly, you mentioned Vince McMahon, and I couldn't help but feel like everything we witnessed sort of was like a Vince McMahon wet dream there, really. Like, it was almost as if this was exactly what he would love WrestleMania to become one day, in a sense. You think of, if you connect WrestleMania and the idea of WrestleMania with bringing in celebrities, and connecting wrestling with entertainment and celebrities, well, that's what Saudi Arabia was able to do this past weekend, except they did it with boxing. If you can really call it boxing. At the end of the day, the main event was fantastic, but it was not what anyone expected. Really, they were creating this extravagance to compensate for what could have been a real circus act or a terrible fight, or at least what people were anticipating to be a terrible fight. That's not what happened at all. Really, what we saw was, amidst another conflict in the Middle East, a war breaking out, you still had the most famous faces in the world flocking to Saudi Arabia to attend a boxing fight at the end, right? You had the Kanye West, the Eminems, you had, Cristiano Ronaldo, The Undertaker was there. It was a spectacle, as you mentioned. And a ring being erected and just brought up in the center of the stage, an opening ceremony for a boxing event. It does feel like Saudi Arabia was out to prove a point. Right, I've had to reflect on this following the event, thinking long and hard about how long Saudi Arabia has been preparing for, Riyadh season, as they call it. This whole boxing match was supposed to be the inauguration of this year's Riyadh season, which is this winter festival that Saudi Arabia is hosting annually. It's supposed to be this big event that brings in tourism for the country. And that was the focus. For weeks, they've been doing nothing but push Riyadh season. They created a music video for this fight. They, erected an installation in London, specifically showing these gaudy statues of the two fighters involved, right by London Bridge. The list goes on and on for how they've been trying to direct focus specifically onto Riyadh season. I thought it was really interesting that, while that did work for the most part, I'd say, the vast majority of the world that watched this event came out of this saying, "Oh my goodness, Saudi Arabia does look like it's going to be the future here. It's proven a point, and it's pulled off a fantastically produced event." Like, we have to give them that, at least. The event was flawless in many ways, but I had to, I, as an Arab in particular, as an Egyptian, I had to reflect on the fact that in the midst of this, we're going through yet another war, another conflict in the Middle East, one that's very close to my home this time as well. Mm-hmm. And the Saudis are really acting like nothing happened whatsoever. And I really wonder if that worked out or it didn't. I get the impression here that they were going out of their way to hide that anything else was happening in the region, that a wider conflict was breaking out, or that Saudi was actually playing a role in this as well. So there are so many layers to this. I think after spending so much time trying to tell people that now Saudi Arabia is going beyond sports washing, John, I actually have to think that this might have been one of those events where distraction and distracting from other concerns was actually a main criteria for Saudi Arabia. So overall, I think a really complex event that requires a bit of nuance to really understand what's been going on.
And it also goes to really just emphasize that the drug of sport is just so intoxicating for somebody to tune in and you watch, what was, the story of this fight was an incredible one. And here you see Francis Ngannou knocking down Tyson Fury. And suddenly, like, you understand why it is so engrossing for fans to be able to distract themselves from the larger issues and the picture being painted here, when that image is going to last forever in people's memory. That, in a nutshell, is what is the objective in something like this. And I think we're only going to see bigger and larger events of this scale. Like, I would be curious to know if this was like the largest budget for a combat sports event in history. I would have to think it probably is, when you take into all the considerations of what went into this coming out party.
I'd love to. Here's going to be one of the issues we have when dealing with authoritarian regimes, is getting that type of transparency in numbers. Apart from generally, you're not dealing with entities that where the laws that you're used to will apply here. But yeah, there's absolutely no transparency. So unless Saudi is aiming to push some PR about how they did some extravagant spending here to create one of the biggest entertainment events, I don't think we're ever going to really find out those figures. I mean, unless documents are leaked to journalists, or journalists are able to see contracts with their own eyes, I don't think we're going to be hearing about this as easily, unfortunately. This is one of the downsides, really, when it comes to working with Saudi Arabia, is you really won't be able to figure stuff like that out very easily.
So when it comes to the coverage of the Ngannou and Tyson Fury fight, this was on ESPN Plus as a pay-per-view on their service. Was there much discussion about the political context of this fight, like in mainstream coverage?
Honestly, not that I was aware of at all. Very, very little discussion about it. I think I saw in The Guardian that Donald McGay, who's a phenomenal boxing reporter, actually, and I highly recommend people read his work and his interviews, in particular with different athletes. He wrote a specific article ahead of the fight while he was in Riyadh that discussed, of course, Saudi's shortcomings in terms of human rights abuses. And he highlighted a women's rights activist called Lojain Al-Hathloul, and spoke to Lojain's sister, Lina Al-Hathloul, who's a well-known activist and Saudi dissident at the moment. And he told the story of how Lojain was put into jail, in Saudi jail, especially at the time where MBS was trying to present, MBS being Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. At the time when MBS was attempting to show Saudi Arabia as a reformed country, and the country that was, changing the way women live in Saudi Arabia, this was around the same time that he jailed Lojain for being a women's rights activist, for attempting to drive a car around in Saudi Arabia and push for more rights, push for an end for the guardianship laws. He ended up jailing her, and it was really only the international outcry that helped get Lojain out of prison. Unfortunately, Lojain is still under a travel ban in Saudi Arabia. So it's really just, he expanded her prison really from 4 walls to the entire country, but she simply can't leave the country. So I was really happy to see Donald's reference. There you go. That Donald referenced this article. I think it was really important. But the fact that I even noticed it goes to show you that it was the only one that I saw ahead of the event. I did a piece for Bloody Elbow, of course, trying to explain the genesis of Fury and Ngannou, and why I thought Saudi Arabia was attempting to host this fight, and why it had invested so much of its resources into hosting the fight, talking a lot about its push for tourism and its attempt to really capture the combat sports space. We've seen Saudi Arabia invest heavily in boxing events in particular. They've hosted some of the biggest heavyweight showdowns. We've seen them plan for further heavyweight events, right? We're supposed to be seeing Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk at some point. It might not be in late December. I highly doubt it will take place in December, but we're supposed to see it. And if we do ever see that fight, I mean, arguably ahead of the fight, we can at least say this is one of the most anticipated heavyweight showdowns in a generation. Easily. And it's Saudi Arabia that brought the fight together, a fight that many boxing fans thought wasn't going to take place. That says a lot for Saudi. And now they have the Ngannou Fury fight under their belt. This is going to be a memory for MMA fans, for boxing fans, for a wide variety of reasons. As you both just mentioned, these are moments people don't forget very easily. People still talk about the Rumble in the Jungle, Thrilla in Manila, all these different events. Saudi is getting some of those notches under its belt now, and that's really, really significant. It's even more significant when you think that combat sports isn't even Saudi's primary game here. Like really, even no matter what we see them spending in boxing and in combat sports, it's a drop in the bucket in comparison to what they're spending overall in various investments and in other sports, right? The money they've spent in soccer, football, whatever you want to refer to it as, far surpasses what they've spent in boxing so far. As for what the future holds, it's going to be really interesting because I think ahead of the fight, I spoke to Luke Thomas and I told him I really think that you can forget about Las Vegas in terms of it being the so-called Mecca of combat sports, that it's really going to be Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates in the future. And some people did not really appreciate that statement, thought I was being ridiculous, and I think they're seeing it in a different light now that the fight's over and what Saudi Arabia is actually able to produce.
And there's news today that Australia has dropped out of their bid for the World Cup in 2034. And that makes it all but certain that Saudi Arabia will get the World Cup in that year.
Oh, Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA, has already announced actually that he's giving it to Saudi Arabia. And he announced this on Instagram, of all things. It's really ridiculous. You think back at, ahead in 2010 or 2009, whenever it was, when the voting happened for the World Cup to be hosted in Qatar, the outrage at the time and the discussions about, where bags full of cash, exchanged in terms for these votes, etc. Now we're talking about a World Cup being handed to Saudi Arabia with no votes, with no discussion, all backdoor deals. And if anything proves to people, when I used to get this statement a lot saying, well, sports washing doesn't work, and it doesn't work because, I already know Saudis commit all these human rights abuses. What's the point? Well, guys, the point is that despite us knowing all of these abuses that Saudi Arabia has committed over the years, they are still an inevitable force. They're still getting all the big events. That's how we know all these tactics work. That's why we know their sports strategy is working, because no matter what abuses they commit, no matter what they will do in the future, nobody is going to part ways with the gold rush and the money that there is to make in Saudi Arabia. And we're seeing that right now with them literally getting a World Cup handed to them with no opposition and no competition whatsoever. That is unheard of. That is unprecedented behavior. And I hope people really wrap their heads around the scale of this and the amount of influence Saudi Arabia wields across sports now.
And the reason why we're having you on now, and we had you on before, is there's a WWE event coming up on Saturday. This one's in Riyadh. And just to remind people who may not be familiar, what the issue is around Saudi Arabia's many human rights violations. In the time between we talked to you last, I've tried to keep up with what's been happening there, and I've read that there's a lot of killing of Ethiopian migrants at the border of Saudi Arabia. There is someone who is sentenced to death because of his tweets, because of his online activity. So if you could just speak to that and just why wrestling fans should care that there's a deal between WWE and the government of Saudi Arabia that's paying them $50 million per event, and why that's something they should care about.
I like that you mentioned the government in particular, because it's very different to say, WWE hosting events in the United States, which in the United States in and of itself is not a remarkable country. Really, there's a lot of human rights abuses being committed here. Its foreign policy is terrible. We can talk about all of that. The difference is, in the United States, there is no sports ministry. Has anyone ever thought about that? Really, there is no U.S. sports ministry. It's not how it works, right? All these things, you're working with private entities and private corporations, and it's very different to operating with Saudi Arabia, where you're working for the government, right? For the purposes of a regime and a political entity. Very, very different behavior, and that really comes out in how they present these relationships with their athletes. You've mentioned the Human Rights Watch report that Saudi border officers have been massacring Ethiopian migrants attempting to cross into Saudi Arabia from Yemen. Now, these reports have been confirmed across various human rights organizations, and the figures and the quotes are really, really, really horrific. I'm not going to repeat them here, but for those interested, you can read the very, very lengthy Human Rights Watch report. What I found really interesting here is that word came out about that as Francis Ngannou was preparing for his fight in Saudi Arabia. And I wrote about this at the time because I reached out to his management to see if Francis Ngannou, himself an African migrant, had any comment about this. He had spoken out regularly about the abuses that African migrants face around the world. He chose not to do that with regards to Saudi Arabia. Now, there are two things we can think of here. We can think, well, why should he feel the need to speak out? He's got all this money that's coming in. He's got these opportunities. And we saw what the opportunity meant to him over this past weekend. So on a human level, on an athletic level, there's that reasoning. But I like to think of it a bit beyond that. A few months ago, I reported for the New York Times that Leo Messi had a tourism partnership with Saudi Arabia, and we were able to show, along with my colleague Tariq Panja, we were able to show the details from that contract, which we had seen ourselves, including the fact that Messi was making $25 million over 3 years to promote the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. What was really, really interesting there was the fact that it also had a clause in it that that Messi could not tarnish Saudi Arabia. It was basically a non-disparagement clause. Now, since then, I've been able to find that clause again, or a similar clause to it, in the framework agreement between the PGA Golf Tour and Live Golf as well. So the merger that's apparently taking place right now, the framework agreement between them also has a non-disparagement clause stating that neither of the two entities can insult the other, and I'm particularly focusing on the PGA not making comments about Saudi Arabia. This was inserted after the 4th round of negotiations in terms of the contract. So it wasn't something that was, standard practice or was there from the very beginning. This was inserted by Saudi Arabia's legal team, or Live Golf's legal team, whichever it was in the case. I really do wonder, guys, if Francis Ngannou has a similar non-disparagement clause in his contract. And if that's the case, we're going to be seeing that across all the major athletes and celebrities that work with Saudi Arabia. They will have clauses potentially that say you'll get extra money if you promote the kingdom, if you say nice things about the kingdom, very much like what Messi does. Every time he posts a picture of Saudi Arabia, including some palm trees, he gets $2 million. I mean, that's a hell of a deal, right, for any athlete. I mean, Messi took it for $25 million over 3 years. Why wouldn't Ngannou take it? Why wouldn't anyone else take it if that was offered to them? So it goes to show you that this is another way that Saudi Arabia is attempting to control the global narrative. It's now no longer about distracting from human rights abuses. They couldn't care less. As Brandon mentioned, there's been an increase almost in the abuses and in the stark realities of these abuses that we're seeing, from slaughtering migrants to some really, really harsh and cruel sentences that are being handed down to people with Twitter accounts with like 20, 30 followers. These are scapegoats now. This is Mohammed bin Salman really emphasizing the new social contract he has with his people. It's a contract where it's saying basically, listen, I'm going to give you everything you could potentially want. Everything. All the major events are going to come here. All the concerts, all the sports, everything is going to be coming to Saudi Arabia. You're going to feel great. Just don't ever speak out about politics. If you do, nothing good's going to happen to you. And that's what we're seeing here. Those who choose to speak out in any way, shape, or form are faced with some horrifically aggressive and harsh punishments as a result. And that's not going to change. And unfortunately, as we see entities like the WWE and all sorts of other major sports entities, I mean, it really doesn't stop at the WWE anymore. As we see them continue to work with Saudi Arabia and focus on this pursuit of profit, the more we're going to see Saudi Arabia continue to commit these abuses and spend even less time attempting to cover them up. Why would they need to anymore? We're seeing their end result, right?
I saw this one quote. This was from Fox News in September when they interviewed Mohammed bin Salman and was asked about the practice of sport washing. And his quote was, "If sport washing is going to increase my GDP by way of 1%, then I will continue doing sport washing." It almost feels as though there's a certain brazenness now that has come where, I mean, you saw sort of the critical assessment that came really from so many big businesses and such towards Jamal Khashoggi. They have come out of that on the other side and have even strengthened themselves, that it feels as though we can now say the quiet part out loud. Like, this is what we are engaging in. And it feels as though there is a certain invincibility when it comes to this strategy. And another part that I've heard you raise up this point, but it's astounding when you hear it, that nearly 70% of Saudi Arabia's 34.8 million people are younger than 35. And when we're talking about big fights and concerts, like, that is feeding so much of your population base that I think they are more than happy for that trade-off.
Absolutely. It's a modern day bread and circuses, right? It's exactly what the Romans once used to do with the Colosseum, right? But this is on just a much more expensive level. And let's say, hold the bread at this point. They're well fed and everything's fine there in terms of the economy. It's really about the circus at this point. Listen, I come from Egypt where we had very few outlets to speak out, to really voice any concerns or anything whatsoever. The outlet that we had was football, the game, soccer, right? That was it. And you had groups like these hardcore, like football groups like the Ultras would rose up around 2007, and the only place you could feel like yourself and would be able to actually speak out was at a football game. And that's where we started chanting political slogans, targeting the police and the government, actually voicing our concerns. And that was terrifying. That was terrifying to the Egyptian government, so much so that in the end, the ultras in Egypt were actually really, really important and pivotal when it came down to the 2011 Arab Spring and actually protesting on the streets of Cairo because they'd had experience combating the police in the past. Now, you compare this to Saudi Arabia, where if he does not keep that population happy and satisfied and able to express themselves and enjoy themselves, then he could go down a similar path that we went in Egypt, right? We had no choice but to use these stadiums and use our joint voices to voice our concerns and to state our rage and our anger. In Saudi Arabia, if Mohammed bin Salman doesn't offer them alternatives, this is exactly what's going to happen. And it's kind of like a Frankenstein's monster thing right now that we're seeing, because he's giving them all these freedoms that Saudi Arabians never had. I mean, I lived in Saudi when I was a kid for about a couple of years. Never liked it, did not enjoy it whatsoever. My family didn't enjoy the process. That's because there was nothing you could do. It was an extremely, extremely strictly conservative country at the time. Very different place now. And that's why all the kids coming up, the Gen Zs in Saudi Arabia, they absolutely love Mohammed bin Salman. But that comes at a price. If he does not continue to feed them whatever they were looking for, really, from entertainment, etc., he's going to get a backlash eventually. And the more freedom he gives them, the more they're going to get used to these freedoms. So I wonder if theoretically one day they start expecting more than just entertainment events. What happens in 10 years when they're used to all this? Let's say we make it to the World Cup in 2034, and it happens. Well, great. Bin Salman will have proven his 2030 vision, held the World Cup, would have been a great World Cup. Let's assume it's a great World Cup and everything goes well. Well, what happens next? What do the actual citizens of Saudi Arabia, who've now had decades of this sort of pseudo-Western experience, they no longer feel diminished or as a minority on the world stage or anything of the sort? They feel equal. What happens then? Do they start asking for more rights? Do they start demanding a change in the country and in the structure? Do they demand more power, create a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy? Anything is really possible when it comes to Saudi Arabia's future. So as much as I see it as inevitable in many ways, this advancement of Saudi sports strategy, I am very curious to see what it means long term as well. And I don't think any of us can answer that question right now.
And just to add, the amount of revenue that these events can make are much lower than the amount of money that the government is paying for them. So clearly there's some other value that the government is getting out of them. It's not just the fact that they're attracting these exciting entertainment events that the local population enjoys, but it's that they're paying well in excess of what these events would draw on their own. Just to add to that's the attraction for the content creators, if you will.
I'm waiting for the membership numbers for the new Mike Tyson gym that has opened up there. I'm sure that will be heavily scrutinized. How many people are joining his new gym?
But I want to make one more point, and I'm interested to get you guys' thoughts on this. As we're seeing this sort of advancement in combat sports, we keep thinking that, okay, the biggest thing they could potentially do is these big boxing fights. They've got their Crown Jewel and Greatest Royal Rumble events and stuff like that. What's stopping them legitimately from, in the next 5 or 10 years, hosting a WrestleMania? People would say, well, I mean, how are you going to fill up a 100,000, 150,000 seat stadium in Saudi Arabia? Americans aren't going to travel in hordes. Well, yeah, but there's a whole other world of people who would love to attend a WrestleMania, very much like the people who went and attended the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, right? Sure, you had your Brits, your Germans, all these people from the famous footballing nations were there, but not in the same quantities as there were Arabs, as there were people from Southeast Asia, from India, etc. I mean, if India is supposed to be one of the populations that loves wrestling the most, then why wouldn't you want them to have better access to a WrestleMania potentially? Make it so it's accessible not just to the wealthiest who can travel to the United States, the ones who are able to secure visas. What's really stopping the WWE from one day agreeing to a WrestleMania in Saudi, especially since we absolutely know Saudi can pay the site fees?
I think it's inevitable, Kareem. I don't think the buy-in is going to be on WWE's end. I think it will be the Saudi Arabian government, the General Entertainment Authority, viewing it as a valuable enough event that can attract tourism, that instead of just a 4-week build to a pay-per-view, we get a whole WrestleMania season dedicated to a commercial for Saudi Arabia. Like, I can only imagine a Vince McMahon sitting there in the front row watching this spectacle and instantly attracting like his product to this kind of pomp and circumstance. I feel it is almost inevitable that we will see an event of that scale in Saudi Arabia during, we're only at the midway point of this 10-year deal.
Yeah.
It's true. And I really think that we've got 6 years until 2030, right? Which is supposed to be the grand unveiling, the final year of MBS's Vision 2030, master plan. Why not host a major event like a WrestleMania in 2030, right? Since he can't have the World Cup in 2030, which was originally when he wanted it, I mean, WrestleMania sounds like a big deal, doesn't it?
Yeah, their 10-year deal, I think, because the pandemic is going to get extended by about 1 year, so maybe it expires in 2028 or maybe even 2029. A lot of the people who attend WrestleMania, and it's the two-night stadium event, but then they'll do an NXT event and a Raw and a SmackDown probably in the same region. I mean, if the money is enough, I guess that satisfies what they need as far as people traveling in to make it truly the spectacle that WrestleMania is with the stadium. I guess I'd have to wonder if people do they feel safe? Does the average wrestling fan who might attend WrestleMania this year in Philadelphia, are they going to feel comfortable traveling to Saudi Arabia? Like, do they feel safe there? I guess is a question that I would think about.
Or go through their Twitter beforehand.
Yes,
like, I'm not even joking. Like, that is something that
true. We've had Lebanese guy get arrested in Saudi Arabia for a Lebanese doctor get arrested for his tweets, right? So absolutely, what you're saying is not an exaggeration in the slightest. But Brandon, to answer what you're saying, I think if you're hosting a WWE WrestleMania in Saudi Arabia, you're not really looking for the same audience that was at the Philadelphia one, right? Why would it have to be the exact same audience when there's a whole other world of people from Southeast Asia and onwards and the Middle East that could fill up those stadiums on those nights, right? It's a matter of how we visualize the audiences of wrestling being. If we keep talking about these events being global sports, and we have to, including, I speak for all sports now and entertainment rather than just the WWE. If we're going to keep talking about our favorite sports as being global, well, at some point we have to start acting like they're global, right? That they're not simply taken from the Western lens or from the US-based lens, right? So this is where Saudi has that advantage, because not only does it have the money to back it up, but it has a whole world that it's already trying to attract through its tourism. I tell people all the time, when you see billboards of Cristiano Ronaldo and it says visit Saudi Arabia next to it, those billboards aren't aimed for people in Germany. They're aimed for people in Egypt. That's where I see those ads all the time, right? I see them on the highways in Egypt. You see them in Bahrain. You see them in neighboring areas like that, right? That's the areas that Saudi Arabia is targeting right now for its tourism. It's not the United States. They couldn't care less about the United States.
I also want to get some of your thoughts, because it caught some people off guard when the UFC announced their own partnership with the General Entertainment Authority in Saudi Arabia. They're going to bring a fight night card to the country on March the 2nd of next year. And maybe if you can also explain what the resistance is between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and do you feel like the UFC can coexist by having prominent positions in both regions of the world?
Oof. I honestly was a bit surprised. I thought it made sense when Saudi Arabia invested in the PFL, because I thought, okay, well, if the UFC is tied in with the United Arab Emirates, at least especially in the region as its exclusive home, then it would make sense that Saudi Arabia would want to find some way to compete against the UFC and against its main geopolitical rival in the region, being the United Arab Emirates. For those who don't know, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, also known as MBZ, are not fans of each other at the moment. Once upon a time, MBS used to consider MBZ his mentor in the region, but as of now, they're political ambitions do not align, and therefore they're not very friendly with each other. You're seeing this in how both are handling the Saudi-led, coalition that's fighting in Yemen right now. Saudi Arabia wants to make peace with the Yemeni government that it sponsors, that it supports, but the United Arab Emirates, on the other hand, is on the other side supporting the Houthi coalition, and that's not really working out very great right now. And it's only increasing a massive humanitarian crisis. That's just one example. So if you take what they're willing to do in war and you apply that now to combat sports, it kind of makes sense here, really, that the UAE would not be very happy with the UFC going and hosting events in Saudi Arabia. I honestly don't understand how this came to be, but it might make sense when you think of the fact that the UFC is only taking a fight night event to Saudi Arabia. I had to think about this for a while because it seems really pathetic. I said this on Luke's show as well. It really is a pathetic thing when, after what we've seen this past weekend, and just generally with the extravagance we see in Saudi Arabia's events, and the fact that whenever they want something in their country, they want the very best of it. For the UFC to think it can slice together a piece of shit card and send it to Saudi Arabia and that people are going to be happy because it's the UFC, well, then I really can't wait to watch the UFC fail in Saudi Arabia, because that's what's going to happen. Saudi's not going to buy that. If you're going to send them, a random, Egyptian or I don't know, whatever Arab fighters there, if you're going to give them Bilal Muhammad to fight, maybe now it works because of the pro-Palestine stuff and there's extra support there. But just in general, you send them an Arab fighter who's not Saudi to fight there, they're not going to care. Right? You're going to give them anything other than big title fights, they're not going to care. So I don't really know what the UFC is trying to do. It seems arrogant and it seems a bit pathetic so far, but we'll hold off until next March and find out. But we know that when they go to the UAE, their annual show has to have a title fight in it. That's part of the arrangement, right? It's a numbered UFC event, and it has a title fight. Right? We've seen this over the past few years. They bring in all their big Arab champions. There has been no indication so far that that's going to be the partnership with Saudi Arabia. So it seems, for the first time we've seen in sports in a while, Saudi got the short end of the stick there. And if that's the case, they're going to immediately realize this, and they're not going to want to continue this partnership. Or you'll see them really squeeze the UFC further through the PFL. I'm really interested to see what happens there. I think we still have a lot of exceptionalism in MMA, thinking that nothing can ever, trounce the UFC. I don't think that's true. I really don't think that's true. We're seeing that play out in the PGA Live Golf situation now, where the PGA was extremely arrogant in thinking that it didn't need to partner with Saudi Arabia. Before all this stuff happened with the merger, Saudi officials went to the PGA and said, "We'd like to partner with you. We'd like to help you." And the PGA said, "No, thanks. We're not interested." I mean, I bet they wish they changed their mind now, right? It goes to show you what Saudi Arabia can do. I understand the UFC's contracts are really
prohibitive.
Exactly, right? But eventually, over the years, people are going to see better opportunities outside of the UFC. The UFC is not going to be able to offer the best money. It's not going to be willing to do so, and people are going to want to go elsewhere. And I think Saudi Arabia really had a big boon, a big successful moment by proving that with their investment in Francis Ngannou, right? They took a big risk. They took a big risk investing in him and bringing him over to fight Tyson Fury, and then to invest that much money in the whole extravagance of the show. And he paid off for them. So many other fighters now are going to want to look at that and say, "Oh, I can't wait for Saudi to back me up and invest in me as well." I bet you anything Conor McGregor wishes he didn't have a contract with the UFC right now, and that he could, just say, "Screw off, I'm going to Saudi Arabia." Because I bet you anything that's the situation he's feeling right now. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the UFC, how the UFC handles itself in Saudi Arabia.
Do you also look at maybe the next step? We have seen, Saudi Arabia linked to F1, to the WWE when it comes to an actual ownership stake, if not purchasing it outright. They have not come away with those brands. But do you feel like that is something that inevitably they are going to continue to kick the tires on, or the idea of just continuing to import the biggest name celebrities and talents and leagues that are coming to our country? Like, do you see ownership as something inevitable when it comes to all of these different sports and entertainment vehicles?
Not necessarily. I think it's going to matter to them to have influence and to exert control. Whether they do that through, excessive sponsorships, whether they do that by simply having relationships with all those top stars in a specific sport. Like, I don't feel the need. Let's talk about soccer, football for a second here. They, instead of purchasing multiple teams, they went and purchased Newcastle United in the English Premier League, and they're doing really well with that team. That team has since the purchase in late 2021, they're now back in the Champions League. They're doing phenomenally there. It's really quite a sight to see, and that's just another example of Saudi saying, "Listen, we're not just throwing money at this; we're trying to make this really work here." But since then, they haven't really spent that much on just acquiring the rest of global football. What they have done is they're sponsoring various events, and they're poaching a lot of players to bring into their own domestic league, sort of propping up their own entities now. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, where Saudi Arabia starts to develop Saudi-owned or Saudi homegrown talent or events and competitions, right? Like their domestic football league. Because I think that at the end of the day, if we're talking about initially they were trying to bring whatever event was willing to work with them, and we're going to talk about that as like sports washing stage 1 for Saudi Arabia, well, now we're far beyond that. Right now, what they're doing is they're trying to project strength, pride, prestige, nationalism, right? This is a branding exercise for Saudi Arabia, right? And one that works both domestically and on foreign soil as well. So it's really, I don't think they need to own all the teams to do so. I think they need to own enough of sports to continue to influence it. As we've seen in football, they own enough and they have enough influence that they were able to secure a World Cup without any competition. Now, they didn't need to own a bunch of leagues to do so, right? They just had to have enough sponsorships in the right places. They need to have the right tournaments and need to have alliances within national federations. So it does require investment of different kinds, but not necessarily always going to be ownership. I think it depends on sport to sport, really.
My last... Oh, you go ahead, Brandon.
Just one more thing. So what we're probably going to talk about in a little while is that Endeavor is being taken private by a big investment firm called Silver Lake, but there's news today that Mubadala is going to be part of this bid as well, which is the UAE's, correct me if I'm wrong, the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund. So, I mean, do you see do you see that playing into, I mean, Endeavor controls TKO, which is WWE and UFC. Does that play into any of this story?
Well, that's interesting. You know, you're catching me. I hadn't heard this news.
Very new news. Yeah.
This is first of all very, very interesting. Well, that just expands the UAE's influence in the UFC, I think. Let's see this.
And for those that might not remember this fact, that it was around 2010 when UFC started going to Abu Dhabi, that Flash Entertainment, which was a subsidiary, actually had 10% of the company, which they had until the Endeavor purchase in 2016. And in time, Endeavor bought that back. But for a long time, Abu Dhabi had a stake in the UFC during its growth years.
And they only bought it back like a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Like they didn't buy it back during the initial.
It was shortly after the sale.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a couple of years or so after, I think, something like that, around 2018 or 2017 when it finally happened. Listen, I think this is yet another example of what, as much as we can talk about Saudi Arabia, we cannot underestimate the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates has been doing this a lot longer than Saudi Arabia. They've been very, very savvy in the process, and they have no shortage of resources either. I think. The UAE, for good and for bad, gets a lot of the same sort of reputation that Canada does alongside the United States. The United States is the loud, boisterous one, gets all the attention and the controversy, while Canada seems to slide away with whatever it's doing a lot more subtly. I think that the United Arab Emirates has a lot of that same, sometimes issue, sometimes benefit, right? When it comes to its sports strategy, fewer people have really paid attention to it outside of, Manchester City. I recently wrote an article talking about how the UAE has been a global home for combat sports for a very long time through its influence in jiu-jitsu, right? And we're seeing that beyond jiu-jitsu, it was the exclusive home for the UFC in the Arab world for a very, very, very long time. I don't think the UAE is planning on giving up the mantle of a global hub for combat sports anytime soon. I think it's well set up. It might even be better set up than Saudi Arabia long-term to maintain a handle on that, just due to the fact that it has spent a lot longer ingraining combat sports into the fabric of its society. When you think about it, jiu-jitsu is a national sport in the United Arab Emirates. It is mandatory and practiced in many school curriculums in the country, in various emirates in the country. It's also mandatory in the police force and in the military. So they've managed to take combat sports and not just apply it as a form of soft power. And mind you, they have an actual soft power council in the government. talk about them really being aware of the benefits of sports and the influence they can wield through sports. They have a soft power council that is actually headed by Sheikh Mansour, who's the guy who owns Manchester City. So they've been doing this for a very long time. They're blatant about it as well. But they've been better at integrating it into the fabric of society. Saudi Arabia is doing that with football because football is its big sport, its national sport, and they have a good, strong history with it. Can they do that with combat sports? I'm not 100% sure. We'll find out, I guess, right? We know that the Saudi audiences love WWE for a long time because WWE has been trying to hold events there for a long time. It's always one of the regions. When I grew up in the Gulf, wrestling was very, very popular during the Attitude Era. Very, very popular. So I can see why they still have an attachment to wrestling, and I can see it in football. Will we see this hold out in boxing and the rest the way it does in the UFC as it does in the UAE? We'll find out.
And just to clarify the ownership, so Endeavor is currently already, I think, about 71% owned by Silver Lake. I guess if Mubadala gets involved, maybe they could own 29%.
Mm-hmm.
That entity controls 51% of TKO. So it wouldn't be control, but influence maybe.
Oh yeah,
my last thing for you, Karim, is that as well, like watching this on Saturday, we can certainly look at this as one of the most powerful brands in sports is ESPN. And that comes with a halo effect that they benefited from on Saturday. And I just look at, the state of, ESPN and their loss of cable subscribers. Like they are certainly feeling this cable crunch like everybody else. And it sort of just gets into that debate as well. Like, would a conversation like this be happening on a ESPN broadcast at this point? When are you covering this as a news event, or are you in business with an entity like this? And that is certainly an added portion of this. Like, there are some great reporters at ESPN, but that is sort of the mixture of you're in business with these entities that you're also supposed to be covering.
I think that's always been the issue with ESPN, though, hasn't it? Despite the fact that, yes, there have been fantastic reporters at ESPN, it always felt like a massive conflict of interest. And we really saw that with the UFC as well over the years, and its relationship with the UFC regularly ignored various issues with the UFC when it visited different places, be it the UAE, be it its relationship, the UFC's clear relationship with Ramzan Kadyrov. That is never mentioned on an ESPN broadcast. The one time I wrote an article for ESPN, it was ahead of the UFC's first visit to Russia in 2018, I think. And I simply wrote an article stating, I think at the time, why the various reasons why the UFC was interested in holding an event in Russia and what the Russia market even meant. It wasn't even by the standard of my reporting generally, it was a very tame article. And the UFC really came back hard at ESPN's editorial team at the time, multiple of whom don't even work at ESPN anymore. So I'm comfortable telling this story. But I was amazed just how much control the UFC thought it could exert on ESPN. They didn't end up removing my story at all. As a matter of fact, they stood by it, which I respect. Again, it was a very tame story. There was nothing not to stand by. But I think the UFC was just horrified by the idea of me even reporting on ESPN, that they had to, lash out somehow at the team. But that goes to show you, the UFC was so arrogant, they think they can just immediately attack a media entity just because they work with them, right? That's the type of relationship ESPN opens itself up with. And I need to stress this. If they thought working with the UFC was bad, they have seen nothing yet when it comes to Saudi Arabia.
Well, Karim, it is always so enlightening to chat with you and just pick your brain. To me, are such necessary discussions when it comes to all of these shows. And I think as we continue to go down the path of this WWE relationship, I think it's very hard for a lot of people to just open themselves up to look at this and kind of look under the rock. And it's a lot easier to just sit back and enjoy the entertainment portion of it. And it's very tricky. Like, I can certainly look at the government's actions and a lot of these atrocities that we speak of, while at the same time, I don't think I would ever be able to speak to a 25-year-old Saudi Arabian fan that is experiencing all of this, nor want to take this entertainment away from them at the same time. But I think both sides do need to be represented. And it's often, these kinds of discussions that I don't think are happening at near enough frequency.
Which is why I really appreciate you guys having me on and continuing to have this discussion.
Where can everyone follow your work, Karim? Tell us about Sports Politica and anything else you have coming up.
Yes, you can absolutely follow my newsletter at sportspolitica.news, and you'll find my work you'll find me on Twitter as well. And my work still appears on The Guardian and the New York Times. You'll find my work in all these different places, depending on what issues are taking place around the world, of course.
I think you'll be a very, very busy journalist for probably years to come, Karim, and we appreciate you. You're a necessary voice out there, and always an open door to join us. So thank you so much, Karim.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you guys so much.